Warning: tuning your vehicle can be a dangerous activity, and there is substantial risk involved. The dangers include, but are not limited to, permanently damaging your vehicle, injury or death to yourself or other people, damaging personal property due to paying attention to a laptop while driving. This video is intended for educational purposes only. Before altering the calibration of your vehicle, you should verify it is in proper working and mechanical condition. Have a working basis of knowledge of how your vehicle works and how the components interrelate, and understand how your tuning software works. Bottom line, you and only you are responsible for making your own decisions, as well as accepting the consequences of those decisions. I cannot be held accountable for your actions. All right, my dudes, welcome back to our final installment of my 6L80E series. Today is the last video. We're going to wrap everything up with just a few final thoughts, and then I'm going to send you on your way to victory lane, my brothers. All right, so the first thing, a couple tips and tricks here, is generally considered good practice by hot rodders and gearheads to overfill the transmission by about a quart. And the reason why is under hard launches, the fluid can slosh around. And when the transmission goes to try to pump that fluid, it may find that it can't reach it. So it's going to suck air and that can damage the transmission. So there are plenty of videos on YouTube of how to do that. It's not that bad. Get the car warmed up. It's got to be between a certain temperature. I don't recall. Level ground. You need to shift it in and out of all the gears. And then with the engine running, you go underneath it and there's a plug, a bolt basically that you unbolt. And, it's one of those things where it's got to drip a certain amount, not too much, not too little, but you kind of get a few dribbles. And at that point, it's considered full. At that point, go ahead and dump in another quart. Now, Genetti Racing, they do make a dipstick, and it's kind of nice. The full line on there is indicative of an extra quart. Now, I'm not sponsored by Genetti. I'm not sponsored by anybody. I'm just a normal dude, your average hot rodder. You pay your money, you take your chances, you learn your lessons, you get bigger and better and faster and stronger every time you fail. So I don't take money or anything from anybody. And hey, if you want to sponsor me, by all means, I'll take your money, right? But uh, I'm just gonna still tell it like it is, right? So um, anyway, that's just one option. There are others out there. The Genetti one does look pretty much stock. It's not exciting or action packed or chrome or anything like that. Low Car makes one. It's pretty nice and fancy, but I think it does require you to drill some holes into the firewall to mount it. And for that reason, I'm out, dog. I'm not going to be drilling any extra holes for that type of stuff. Now, if you do have a aftermarket high stall converter, you're going to need an auxiliary transmission cooler. Keep that fluid cool. Hot transmissions are not having a good time. So you definitely want to do that. Now, there's some controversy involved of, okay, you need an aftermarket cooler, now what? What a lot of guys do, and I'm not a fan of this, is they're going to go out and they're going to buy the True Cool 40K, the biggest, baddest cooler on the market. And then they are going to run the transmission lines directly to that and then directly back, bypassing everything else in the system. And I'm not a fan of that. Um, just like your engine, they engineer it and they design it for a specific weight, viscosity of oil. And that's based off of operating temperature and the bearing clearances. The transmission was not designed to be run with cold fluid. It needs some heat. That's just how it was designed. So I would encourage you, um, and this now I'm speaking from a car perspective, which, my understanding the cars didn't really have problems like the trucks did with the 6L80E. If you're dealing with a truck, that's kind of out of my experience level, so don't listen to this. Cover your ears, close your eyes, don't listen. But for you car guys, I'm going to say your best route is to run the lines to the engine radiator And then from the radiator, it goes to the factory thermostat and then the factory cooler. And then finally, it goes to the aftermarket cooler, and then that gets routed directly back to the transmission. Now, this has some advantages. Number one, when the transmission is cold, running the lines through the factory radiator is going to get that transmission fluid warmer quicker. Once it's hot, I got to imagine the transmission fluid is probably significantly hotter than um, the engine coolant. So it's gonna get cool, and the water to water or fluid to fluid cooling is a lot more efficient than air to water. So it's going to transfer that heat, that initial hot from that transmission to the radiator, and it's going to cool off. From there, it's going to go to the factory thermostat. Again, it needs to have some heat. We can't just run super frigid air into the transmission. It needs the right viscosity. It's been engineered to run at a certain temperature. So we want to keep that. And I want to say, I think for my car, it was like it's 180-degree thermostat, I believe, something like that. Yours obviously may be different. And then, you have the factory transmission cooler. That's just free BTUs, right? You take that and use it. I mean, why get rid of it? And then you can get a smaller aftermarket auxiliary cooler. Um, so I would encourage you to keep that. And, don't take my word for it. Monitor your transmission temperatures. On my car is runs happy. It's pretty much like 180 degrees. I mean, it may sneak up a little bit on a hot day if I'm a little hot and heavy on the throttle to 190, but rarely, I think, in the heat of summer does it get past 195, and that's still an exception. But either way, log your transmission temps in HP tuners. Keep an eye on that and look at it. And if you feel like you need more cooling, then you can go and experiment from there and try to figure something out. But at least by default, that's how you should start. Also, the lines on your coolers should be facing up, so that way air can escape. We don't want to have trapped air. That's just going to prevent, just like in your normal engine coolant, when you have air bubbles, heat can't transfer. So you want to get rid of those air bubbles. So keep the connection lines to the top, not on the sides, not on the bottom. You can also provide extra cooling and fluid capacity by getting a deep pan conversion. Depending on, ride height, that may be an issue. I was looking at the B&M one. It adds 1.8 quarts of capacity, and with the cooling fins, they only stick apparently 3/4 of an inch lower than the factory pan. So not that bad, really. I mean, hopefully you're not that close to the ground driving on the street. Um, but anyway, that's just something else to consider. So here's a picture of my setup. You can see the cooler's here. It's mounted onto the front bumper. The internal, bumper hidden behind the fascia and the grill. And the A and N fittings are pointed straight up and down for air to come out. OEM thermostat is in there. If I ever have problems with overheating, what I'll probably do is just remove this thermostat and run without it and test it. If that doesn't work, I may put it back in and then bypass the engine radiator. And then if that doesn't work, then bypass them both. And then I'll just run through the factory cooler and the aftermarket cooler. But so far, so good. I've had good luck. It's working out good. All right, so the weak areas. The factory JMBX converter is really the problem child. So I found this great picture of a cutaway view that someone did on the converter. And basically, this is like the piston that comes down under pressure and it can deflect. So, we were talking about the torque converter pressures and all that, the apply ramp and all that kind of jazz. Well, too much pressure is going to cause it to warp, or not warp, but deflect or deform. And so you can see you kind of have a small contact patch here. And so less contact, less friction, more slippage, more heat. So good news, bad news. The friction material is this carbon weave, which is very strong, very tough. And the fact that it's the carbon weave, well, the carbon handles the heat great, no problems. And the weave actually allows transmission fluid to enter and cool it even while it's locked up, which is a good thing because, locked up, the factory tables allow for slip. So it's locked up and slipping. Fluid is still circulating in there, keeping it cool. But the problem remains that slippage is still generating heat. And while that carbon weave says no problem, I can handle the heat, well, that heat has to go somewhere. And so the front cover is one of those areas it goes. It's made of metal, and that is a problem because here's a picture of my factory converter, and you can see these tabs. This is the engine side, right? This is the flex plate is right here, and this would be, facing the engine. Well, here's the boss that's welded on for the bolt hole, and you can see it's welded on. Well, welding introduces tension and stress in the metal, and when you start adding heat, it's now going to begin to warp. And as good as that carbon weave is at dealing with heat and slipping, the one weakness, the Achilles heel that it has is it needs a flat, smooth surface. So as the heat builds up, this cover starts to warp a little bit and it just destroys that carbon weave, which is only 20 thousandths of an inch thick. And so then that carbon starts going through the transmission fluid. Next thing you know, you get metal to metal and bad things happen. And then you are not a happy camper. By contrast, here is a picture of my personal Circle D converter. And you can see it is a one-piece billet CNC machined, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous thing of beauty. It is a shame to cover that up with a flex plate and then throw that thing in just the bowels of the drivetrain, never to be seen again. But I'm happy I get to share this with you guys. I hope you enjoy looking at this as much as I do. Speaking of a Circle D, I said I would maybe, follow up with these guys, see what they say, their viewpoint on how much pressure I should be using or not using to lock up the converter. And I was so disappointed with their reply. I mean, I get it, right? CYA, they don't know who's out there doing what. And so they're just like, go hire someone else to tune your car, you noob. I get it. So at least I'm like, well, hey, at least tell me, like, what's like the maximum pressure, right? Because, after reading about the piston on the factory JMBX converter deflecting under pressure, I'm thinking, man, oh, well, I hope I don't do that to mine. Like, what's burst? Like, if I buy an intake, right, and I'm gonna put a turbo on it, I'm probably gonna ask the manufacturer, like, what's maximum PSI I can throw at this before it bursts, right? So I figured that's probably a safe question to ask about the converter. But no, then they, man, and I don't have anything good or bad to say about 6L80etuning.com. I think I've heard positive and negative thing about them. I have no personal experience, right? But and same thing for mail order tuner, but man, they just doubled down and then just said, go talk to mail order tuners. Wow, that's brutal. Thanks, guys. I was expecting more. Oh well. All right. As far as the other weak areas, full throttle downshifts that tends to tear things up. So you don't want to do that. Hopefully you can plan ahead. I mean, I get it. There's just some times where you're like, screw this, I'm out of here, and you're just gonna dump the throttle. But if you can, plan ahead, use tap up, tap down, drop down some gears, and then pin the throttle. And then hint, hint, uh, if you're doing that, you're probably paying attention on not crashing or something more important things, rather than shifting or forgetting to slap the stick back over into auto or drive or whatever. So, having that tap up, tap down do the auto shift for you is just it's the right thing to do, my man. Go ahead and do it. You know you want to. Okay. Now, let's get into some goofy stuff. I'm going to tell you this to set up the next slide, which is my biggest concern. So, back in the day, people noticed the first two, three shift, first thing in the morning, hey, I'm going to go to the office, driving, leaving down the neighborhood. And man, that first two, three shift is awfully goofy. Well, GM heard their complaints and basically said it's air in the clutch solenoid. Like, it's fine, it's normal, just ignore it. But if you're really that paranoid, shift it into reverse, which is going to activate the right clutch packs and everything, and basically fill it with fluid and purge the air. And of course, you don't even need to drive in reverse, but at least just make that connection into reverse and then hit drive. So the people who never hit reverse, or I should say the people who did reverse, maybe to get out of their garage, they never noticed this, right? But the people who parked on the street, maybe in such a way that, hey, they just get in, they drop it and drive and they go, they're the ones that saw this. All right. So keep this in mind for my biggest gripe and my biggest concern is the first wide open 3-4 shift does the same crap and it pisses me off. Now, normal day to day, obviously this isn't a big deal. But when I'm at the drag strip, it definitely it just ticks me off. And so the reason why is because you normally make a pass, and then depending on how busy it is that night, you may not get another pass for 15 minutes, half hour, maybe it's an hour. So you're sitting there with the hood up, trying to keep everything from heat soaking, and then you get back in the car. You're idling, through the pits and the staging lanes, whatever. You get up there and it's finally like, okay, this is it. Like I've been waiting an hour to make this pass. And for me, man, it's like you're halfway down the track or whatever, and it's the very last shift, this 3 to 4 shift, at least for my gearing, and it hangs. It does a shift. It takes forever to shift into fourth, and while it's waiting to shift, the RPMs just continue to rise and rise, and then it does a hard shift, and I hate it. Now, this was really a problem on street tires because when you're on street tires, you drive around the water box because you don't want to get them wet because all the sipes and the tread. And you can't do a big burnout because street tires aren't made for that kind of heat and they gum up and they ball up and you lose traction. So you just got to do a little baby burnout to keep them happy. So that's a problem. Now, after I went to radials and I'm doing a big, nice smoky burnout in the water box, I didn't realize it till I got home and I was looking at my logs from HP Tuners. It shifted into fourth gear, just in the burnout, which pretty insane. But so I never had those issues. But I'm not really a fan. So the only workarounds, drive as fast as you can and hopefully get it into fourth gear, as you're working the staging lanes. Probably you can. Um, it's probably not safe to do that. I wouldn't even recommend doing it, right? Um, or you just hot lap it, which, again, depending on the night, that may not be possible. So here's the thing. A lot of people say, I don't know what you're talking about. This is imaginary. It's all in your head. And I think it goes back to, are you the type of person that reverses out of the garage? Are you the type of person that parks on the street? Depending on how you drive the car in your individual situation, you may never see this. So I'm asking you, test this out yourself. Most likely, if you're listening to this video, you got a little secret spot. You don't tell everybody where it's at, maybe just your buddies, but your testing spot. Go there, get the engine nice and hot and warmed up, ready to go. Never go full throttle on a cold or partially warmed up engine. But get to your spot, turn the car off, don't open the door because when you do, that deactivates computers, blah, blah, blah. I want you to experience this the way that GM wanted you to experience it. Turn off the car, stay in the car, don't open the door, don't take off your seatbelt. Wait a few minutes, and you're going to start hearing the computers shutting down. I mean, it's not going to be beeps or whatever, but you're going to hear clicking sounds. And that my theory is as power is removed, The solenoids that's holding fluid in the transmission relax, fluid drains out, allowing air to enter. So once you hear those clicks after a few minutes, go ahead, start the car up and get her into wide open throttle. I mean, you may have to shimmy around a little bit to get to your ideal spot, but just as long as you don't let it go into fourth gear before you get into wide open throttle, you're gonna feel and see and hear that shift hang. I've tried in the tune, like if I could change the tap up, tap down to a much lower value for fourth gear, maybe it'll let me shift into fourth gear at 5 miles an hour, or because I can be at idle 0 miles an hour, I can shift into third, but I cannot, the computer, the car, whatever, is not going to let me shift into fourth gear. I can't remember if it's like 37 or 39 miles an hour. Maybe it's 41. I can't remember the number, but there's no way around it. The only car that I think it's possible to do this on is the C6 Corvette because the tap up, tap down is routed directly to the transmission. But all other cars, the wiring for tap up, tap down goes through the BCM, the body control module. That intercepts the signal and that has logic in there. And then if the BCM says no good, you're not going fast enough, it's going to prevent that from going to the transmission. So obviously HP tuners can't program the BCM. I've looked at other companies. There's a few out there. There seem to be all geared for the trucks. There was one guy, Chris White at White Audio Media, I think it was, but he's closed up shop. He was my best hope because he specifically worked on stuff on my platform. But I reached out to him, and of course, he's like, "Oh, you're crazy. Tap up, tap down. That doesn't go to the BCM. That goes directly to the transmission. I can't help you." So I have been turning up nothing. If you have any ideas for a workaround or hacking the BCM, like I don't necessarily want to start hacking up the wiring harness and pulling the plug for the transmission and going that route, but uh, maybe one day I get bored enough, who knows. But anyway, if you can test it, if you have a workaround, if you know the A team, like whatever, man, help me out on this one. I'm dying to find out the answer to this. All right, so let's just wrap everything up with some conclusions here. Just quick review. The shift time and pressure. I think I kind of botched that first analogy I made about, goal and budget. Your goal is the shift time. That's the only thing that matters. The budget is the pressure. That's how you achieve your goal. And really, the adaptives are in the background to say, hey, let me help you out. I can save you some money on your budget. So don't sleep on those adaptives. The next thing is, if the adaptives make the transmission start going soft over time, that's just an indicator that your shift times are not aggressive enough and you commanded too high of a pressure. Remember, old school thinking before you had computer controlled engines and transmissions and ones that were synergistically talking to each other, there was no torque management, yada, yada, yada. Um, and so, how did you make those old transmission shifts fast and with authority? Well, with pressure. But that is not the case on the new ones. Time is what controls everything, the shift time. The pressure, just how you get there. Yeah, so pressure, not a good thing. Allow those adaptives to use as little pressure as needed to get the job done. Otherwise, you're going to start wearing things out faster than they need to be. Speaking of adaptives, do not change the volumes for the adaptives on a stock transmission. Only do that if you've thrown in aftermarket parts and you have the specific data. Even if you do change them, they will fix themselves over time. But stock parts, get the stock volumes. Don't mess with them. Torque management. A lot of people will disable torque management. I would highly suggest not doing that if you would like your transmission to live a longer and happier life. Torque management is also going to be one of the biggest factors in how the transmission feels when it shifts. So as you go through tuning, you need to kind of use your calibrated butt dyno and feel like, well, what is the difference of too much or too little torque management? What does too fast or too long of a shift time feel like? What does too much or too little pressure feels like? So you should make one change at a time and kind of see how that changes things. Um, and then as you start tuning more and more, you're like, oh, you know what? That's too much torque. I need to calm that down a little bit, rather than well messing with time or pressure or something. Virtual torque is also going to play a huge role in how the transmission shifts because transmission is going to look at, well, how much torque is being generated, and therefore, how much pressure do I need when we're making this much torque? So if you artificially, so to speak, increase pressure or increase torque through virtual torque, you're also going to indirectly increase the amount of pressure the transmission is going to use. As you recall, I showed you some histograms that you can set up. I mean, I didn't go into detail, but if you saw that, you should understand the gist of how to get those set up to log your torque. So you can figure out how to adjust your own virtual torque. Bottom line, your goal as the tuner is to have a fast shift, but a smooth shift. You don't want a rough, clunky, uneven shift, right? You want full cup of coffee on the dashboard as you shift. It does not spill. Shift scheduling. Just make sure that the full throttle, the 100% spot on your part throttle tables matches and meets up with your wide open miles per hour. They should basically meet, touch perfectly. Dialing in wide open throttle is going to take a little bit of time to determine the lead time needed to get the shift to occur at either the correct miles per hour or the correct RPMs. And as you recall, I did create that spreadsheet that will back calculate lead times for you if you just plug in a few basic pieces of information. Also, as mentioned before, be cool, Daddy O. Don't be a square. Um, use the tap up, tap down. You have a super hyper modern day electronically computer controlled transmission. Like use the super cool features, okay? For tap up, tap down, let it auto shift for you at the extremes. I mean, you don't want to look like a dummy and miss a shift in an automatic transmission. That is embarrassing. So, come on. And finally, torque converters. Slip is a bad thing. Avoid it at all costs. Zero out the slip tables. Add pressure as needed to prevent the slipping. Keep it cool. Keep it under control. Unless you have an aftermarket converter with a multi-disc or a multi clutch, I guess I should say. It's late. I'm sorry. Uh, Yeah, multi-disc converter. You never want to lock up a single disc. That's just a recipe for disaster. Well, I should say, don't lock it up at wide open throttle. Part throttle, sure, go ahead and lock it up. All right, and then definitely you're going to want to log your line pressure and torque converter slip, just to make sure that everything is in in simpatico and not slipping. Keep it cool. And if you have a big cam with an aftermarket high stall converter, just totally, completely skip locking up in the early gears and just save that for the highway gears, fifth and sixth for part throttle cruising. So that's it. That's going to wrap it up. Um, I appreciate you guys sticking with me through all of these videos. I had no idea I had this much to talk about. And honestly, I learned a lot, making these videos, forcing me to re-examine everything that I thought I knew and double checking. It's caused me, I can't tell you how many changes I've made to my own tune. I thought I had it finally sorted out, right? But after this, like I've redone quite a bit, even after making these videos. Specifically, Genetti Racing had a great input about that final minimum spark, and I'm like, oh, so that's why when I'm coasting down, the spark is stuck at positive 4 degrees. So I dropped it back down, and sure enough, now when I'm coasting back down, for the grams a second there under less than what I have at idle, it's actually going down into negative or retarded spark. What else did I change? I totally changed my shift scheduling. So all the stuff that you saw that I had graphed out in those pretty graphs, yeah, that totally changed. And probably a few other things that I don't remember. So you guys have had a lot of great comments, a lot of positive support, and you guys are awesome. I appreciate everything. So I'm going to drop some more videos. I'm probably going to shift, no pun intended, probably do some videos on the engine side of things. So be on the lookout for those. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, I would love it, thrive on it, appreciate it. Um, anyway, be awesome and onwards and upwards, my dudes. Have a good one. Bye.